Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IIBA event this morning on remote working. To give it its new shortened title that I've given it, Challenges, Solutions, and Next. And we're looking forward to a very interesting conversation this morning. The pandemic that we've lived through for the last year, it's been truly global in nature. We're all experiencing, give or take, much of the same sort of things, especially those in working life, how we're working, how we're going about our daily business. The changes that are coming about and that are being, I'd say, both driven and facilitated by this are quite enormous, but they're also global. And they affect every country around the world. But each country brings its own culture and its own approach to things as well. And that's why it's important that we have these events in the IIBA to understand both what's happening locally with us here, what's happening in relation to how things are being managed in a trans-Ireland, India sense as well, but also understanding that that's a small part of actually what's happening at the moment, which is something which is truly global. I'd like to welcome this morning our four speakers, who I'll name in order here. Our first speaker this morning will be Deepak Chaudhari, who's Vice Chair of the IIBA. Deepak took over as Vice Chair when I took over as Chairman just a month ago. So welcome, Deepak. Deepak is the country head at TCS in Ireland here. We'll follow that with Nuala Clayton, who's a partner in employment and benefits in William Fry, who will bring us through some of the interesting legal aspects of what's going on at the moment with remote working. Then we've got Ved Sen, who is also from TCS, and I think the one thing I can say about Ved, he's got the most interesting job description that I've come across yet as digital evangelist. So really looking forward to listening to you this morning, Ved. And then we'll finish off with David Kirton, who's going to talk to us about cyber and data security in the context of remote working. After the four presenters this morning have given their short presentations, we'll then enter into a panel discussion for about maybe 20 minutes. And you should have a Q&A button on your screen there. Please use the Q&A button to ask questions, and we won't delay during the presentations, but I'll collate the questions together at the end as part of the panel discussion, and that'll inform and drive the direction of the panel discussion. So thank you very much, everyone, this morning. Thank you for attending, and I'll now pass you over to Deepak Chaudhari, who will talk about technology and technology services in a managerial sort of context as we work through this crisis and through the remote working. Thanks, Deepak.
Well, thank you very much. Well, a very good morning to all of you. For all of us, last year was a very different year in many ways, and no one had really expected and was really fully prepared for it. The pandemic has killed millions of people around the world. It's devastated the global economy, brought industries to complete standstill, and there have been multiple layoffs, multiple retail departments which have closed and so on. So there is, of course, enough chaos what has been caused in the last year. But having said that, we would, however, prefer to look at it through the lens of optimism and positivity. And actually, we believe this is an inflection point in the way business operates today. So remote working, which was probably some time back, it was a little frowned upon. It's no longer frowned upon now. It's bringing complete paradigm shift in the very nature of working. It is allowing organizations to fully tap into the talent availability across. It gives new age technologies a chance to help the businesses, and it offers equal opportunities across the geography, gender, and also having a positive impact on the environmental footprint. And we can see a number of industries have reacted very well to the challenge. So if you look at technology companies, life science, pharmaceutical companies, courier logistic companies, online education, training, video streaming, number of industries, fitness, cybersecurity, home improvements, virtual events, the way they are taking place across. So all of such industries actually need increased amount of workforce, the technology infrastructure, to cater to the demand. Companies are able to now optimize on their retail space. Companies are able to tap into wider talent. And in doing so, the companies are also wanting to ensure right kind of business continuity and right kind of geographic distribution, including nearshore activities to ensure the risks are mitigated. So this gives a great opportunity, and especially to the forum here, it's a great opportunity for India and Ireland to really expand and support each other very well. And it could be on research and development, manufacturing support that's needed. There are breadth of skills, what can be leveraged across both the countries. The educational sector can be collaborating also very closely. Like at Tata Consulting Services, we are not calling it new normal, and we prefer to call it as a new beginning. We are having 95% of our global staff, around 450,000 of them, who are working remotely now. And we have seen tremendous amount of productivity improvements. We have even seen, while we are looking forward to returning to work, we are planning that 25% of our staff are going to be the ones who will be actually at the office premise by 2025. And when it comes to Ireland, we have invested into a center in Ireland during this pandemic time, and we have added about 1,500 skills to us in Ireland, which will provide us the right kind of business and technology services in closer proximity for our customers in UK and Europe. So even though it's a pandemic time, we have seen multiple companies have really expanded. Some of them have added billions of dollars of additional value to their market caps. If you take the likes of Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Tesla, Facebook, Netflix, they're all having a much stronger market positioning than what it was a year back. So I will say that while employees have started commuting long distance, stopped commuting long distances for their work, the air has gone cleaner. By working remotely, we are able to spend more time with our families. We are able to balance our work life better. Many of us, there are of course people who are working continuously for long hours, but it's helped us to balance in many ways. And we are starting to see a long-term promise of work truly being borderless. Work can be performed effectively and remotely, and it's an opportunity to tap into full capacity of the human cloud. So this is truly an inflection point for the corporate world. And on that note, I want to invite Nuala to discuss the key employment and health and safety law considerations which arise in terms of working remotely. Thank you very much. Nuala, are you able to see?
Hi, Deepak. Thanks for that. Good morning, everyone. And thanks to the IIBA for asking me to join this morning's panel. I'm delighted to be here. So I suppose in terms of what I'm going to discuss this morning, I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Deepak has highlighted in relation to remote working, but also point out some of the key employment and health and safety law obligations and duties which arise for employers in relation to having a workforce who is working from home. And I suppose, as Deepak said, it's a really good time to speak this morning and to reflect, because we're approaching the 1-year anniversary of the time when we all frantically left the office and brought whatever we needed home for what we thought would be a short period, but which has gone on for much longer. And it's a good time for employers to really assess how that has gone so far for employees, and to look at what they've learned in this context and how they can best manage remote working if it is here to stay to some extent. So I suppose a really good starting point is to let everyone know, and for those who aren't aware, that the Health and Safety Authority in Ireland, who is the Irish regulator for workplace health and safety matters, published a document in Q4 of 2020. So it took a while, obviously, to bed into the system and to get some guidance up and running in relation to this, but it was very welcomed when it was published. The document is entitled Guidance on Working from Home for Employers and for Employees. And I'd really encourage attendees to have a read of the document, because it's straightforward and it's very, very specific in terms of the obligations arising for employers who have a workforce at home. And while it's very, very useful, I suppose the one thing I would say is that the document absolutely recognises, as Deepak has said, the real benefits of working from home, but it also points to the challenges both for employers and for employees. And less on an employment law or health and safety law front and more on a human note for a second, I suppose I'd just speak to what I've seen in practice this year with various clients who have their workforces at home, and really turning to the kind of human, softer stuff. A lot of employees have experienced and have reported feeling isolated and challenged in relation to remote working. And certainly employers absolutely acknowledge, and I'm sure a lot of us this morning would acknowledge, that there are concerns around things like organizational culture, innovation, the impact on productivity when you have a workforce who is at home. And I think the key matters that kind of have to be addressed in that context are things like employee engagement, employee focus and morale, motivation, relationships within a team, and the management of workplace stress. Because even though we are at home, all of those things that arise in the workplace are more acutely felt, in my opinion, when you're not in a physical office beside your colleagues and sort of able to interact in that way. So while those things that I mentioned aren't necessarily employment or health and safety legal obligations per se, they're really important because they are key check-in matters for employers to bear in mind, and the real basics in terms of how we best communicate with the workforce at home. Because bear in mind that all of those things ultimately feed into things that could become legal matters, such as stress at work claims, personal injuries claims, claims in relation to disabilities, or claims in relation to opportunities for progression and so on. So I suppose turning to how an employer best manages a workforce at home who is working remotely, how does an employer manage expectations? How does an employer ensure that it meets those obligations and duties as guided by the regulator? Well, the first thing the HSA has pointed to is that all employers should put in place a remote working policy. And many attendees today may have a remote working policy. They may have had one pre-pandemic, and some attendees might not have yet taken that step. And as I said at the start, at the 1 year mark, it's a really good time to step back and say, well, if we have a policy, does it remain fit for purpose? Do we need to tweak and update it in line with best practice learnings and guidance? And if we don't have a policy, we should be looking to the future, because as we've said this morning, remote working is something that is here to stay. And so having a policy that sets out and manages expectations that apply to that arrangement is certainly something that employers should be looking at for sure. And I think that I suppose a real key focus, turning to the health and safety legal obligations for a moment, is that the HSA guidance makes it really, really clear that the responsibility for health and safety at work rests with the employer. And that is the case whether or not your employee is in the office or whether or not they are working at home. And pausing there for a moment, I suppose it's absolutely the case, and I've seen it over the last 12 months, that many employers didn't necessarily appreciate that to be the case. And perhaps they thought that when employees were at home, they weren't in the office, and those health and safety obligations were diluted to some extent. But that actually isn't a new law or a new definition. That definition of place of work, including a home as a workplace, is nearly 20 years old. And in that context, the HSA has told employers that they should be looking at health and safety in this regard. So they should be assessing the risks for their employees who are working from home. Health and safety matters at home cover things like workplace stress, as I've mentioned. They cover things like working time and adequacy of rest breaks, and the provision of equipment, so the real tangible stuff, equipment and resources to allow employees to work most effectively and safely. So it's a really broad spectrum area, and employers, are reminded to bear in mind that they are statutorily obliged to look at this and to seek to identify risks as they relate to an employee's workstation at home, bearing in mind that we're all working in really different environments. Some people are in their living room, some people are in their dining room, their bedroom, and so on. And we're all in a really different setup. So what the HSA has stated is that an employer should be engaging individually with each employee in relation to risks as they present themselves in that employee's home, and then seeking to put in place control measures to minimize those risks. So the guidance document I mentioned gives a sample document to allow an employer to do this. It's really helpful, really clear, really useful, and it's something that I would absolutely encourage employers to look at to ensure they're ticking that box in terms of obligations. I mentioned a moment ago working time and rest breaks, and it's something that Deepak has mentioned already. And I think we'd all agree that in the last 12 months, and I certainly would say that I feel permanently switched on. So sort of wedded to the laptop, it's always close by, and it's not that natural break that you get when you leave the office in the evening. And so that's something as well that to a lesser extent maybe hasn't been cast into the same light as other employment and health and safety law matters during the pandemic, but which is absolutely key to ensuring that you're meeting obligations in this regard. So in terms of working time, it's making sure that you're adequately recording your employees' working time. So their daily and weekly working hours, their rest breaks during the working day. And the statute actually says that employers are obliged to keep those records for 3 years from the date of creation. So again, this is nothing new. Those obligations have been in place since the late 90s, but I suppose it's looking at these in an innovative way and figuring out how an employer can best meet those obligations when everyone is at home, because you can't see that Nuala has gone for a coffee break, has taken her lunch break, and tick the box in terms of making sure people are adequately resting. So it's looking at different mechanisms to deal with that. In practice, I've seen employers who have gone into the world of looking at apps relating to working time. Certainly other employers are meeting that obligation by way of a weekly check-in with online timesheets. So it's stepping back and seeing what has gone before and what is coming, and making sure no issues arise going forward as remote working rolls out to a greater extent than it has done before. That topic, I think, neatly feeds into the right to disconnect. So looking to the future and what is coming down the line, one thing that the Irish government has made really clear is that there's a twofold approach in relation to its consideration of remote working in Ireland going forward. One aspect is the right to disconnect. That is driven by EU level, EU parliamentary direction and a directive that issued a few years back on the adequacy of employees and their work-life balance. So whilst it was in the pipeline, it's absolutely become more relevant and more important during 2020. And I'm sure you're all aware that many European member states have already put legislation in place to deal with an employee's right to disconnect. So certain manufacturers in Central Europe have a mechanism whereby they turn emails off at a particular point in the day, and they make sure people are on annual leave and they can't access emails. So when the issue has been focused in that way before the pandemic, it's absolutely something that's even more in focus post-pandemic. And it's something that's really important and goes to morale and all those key issues I mentioned at the start. So it's expected that the Workplace Relations Commission in Ireland will publish in Q1, so in the coming weeks, a code of practice in relation to an employee's right to disconnect. So a code of practice, whilst it's not statute, it's not legislation, it's absolutely key guidance for employers in this context. The second strand of remote working and the Irish government's focus is the announcement and the recently published national strategy in relation to remote working. And that strategy is something that the government has committed to roll out during 2021. And I'm sure you've seen the media coverage in that context. And it looks at things like the Irish infrastructure to support remote working. But it also says that in Q4, or at least the aim is for Q4, the government is actually going to legislate for employees and their right to disconnect. So an employee will be entitled to seek to continue to work remotely post-pandemic. Now, I would flag that we're not yet clear how that's going to look, what the obligations will be specifically, but it's absolutely something to bear in mind in terms of making plans, looking to the future, building on what we've learned to date, and putting in place really good foundations to seek to keep remote working as part of an organisational setup going forward. So finally, at a very high level, one key issue I want to mention, and I think it would be remiss of me not to mention, is that for a lot of employers, a portion of their workforce may be working outside the jurisdiction at the moment. So outside the jurisdiction in which the employee is employed. And certainly that's something we've seen crop up a lot in the last 12 months. The topic could be covered by a whole webinar itself, but I would just flag that as this arrangement is likely to continue, if that's something that applies to employers, don't see it as a challenge necessarily. See it as an opportunity to examine how you can best protect an organisation from risks relating to employment law rights, health and safety law, tax matters, and data protection matters, if it's the case that perhaps that would be something that would be supported as part of a remote working model going forward. So it's really to start planning, and that's the key message that I would have for everyone this morning. So those matters are intended to provide a real high-level summary of key employment and health and safety law issues that relate to remote working. And I'm now going to pass to Ved, who's going to discuss with us the opportunities and the challenges of a digitally supercharged working model in a post-COVID world.
Hello, and thanks, Nuala. I hope everyone can hear me clearly, and thank you very much to the IIBA and of course to Deepak and Nuala for fairly insightful comments. I was stuck between making notes and just getting my notes in order. So I'll go very quickly over the next 10 minutes to talk to you about what we think from a digital and technology perspective are some of the really interesting things to think about, challenges that we have to solve. Some we have solved, and some, of course, every new scenario, every new solution throws up another interesting set of challenges. So let's go through that very quickly. If I just think back to a year, and we're interestingly coming up to the anniversary of working from home almost, I think we entered, a year back when we went into working from home. The first phase was a novelty phase. It was maybe the first month was, isn't this fun? We don't have to commute, and this is great. We can just kind of sit in our pajamas and have our get our work done. That's great. And then it's sort of after the first month, we kind of fell into the routine phase, and then sort of 3 calls a day with the teams, check in the morning, check in the evening, and sort of there was a regularity to all of that. And I think shortly after that, sort of let's say another 6 weeks later, and for the last 9 months has for a lot of people been, oh my God, please make it stop phase. Because we've all realized that actually we are working harder, we're not getting the breaks, we've stopped exercising, therefore we're probably all eating badly. All this stuff is going on, except for the few who are incredibly determined and are doing lots of exercise in this time. I certainly went into the lockdown thinking this is great. I mean, I will have so much more time. I'll come out of this like Superman. I'll be running marathons by the end of it, of course. Yesterday was the first time I went for a run in like 6 months' time. And that's because the lockdown is ending and I feel like I should do something about it. So there are lots of challenges that we see at the workplace because of all of this. And I'm sure you'll have additional ones to talk to, beyond what I can share with you. But let me give you a few that I think are really interesting ones. I mean, the first thing, of course, that happened was there was a loss of serendipity. We realized that a huge amount of work actually happens through chance meetings in our workplace. People you meet at the water cooler, someone you haven't met for 3 months who you suddenly realize is doing something really interesting that's relevant to your work. And we underestimate how much of work actually gets done through those kinds of mechanisms. And it's become very acute right now. The next thing is the loss of separation. The idea of home versus office. And for those of you who like to keep that separate, it's an even harder challenge. And for those of us, myself included, who have a habit of blending, I think the boundaries become even less clear. Suddenly we are seeing each other's homes, we are hearing the sounds and seeing the pictures, and the doorbell goes off suddenly. So all of this has become part of work. Our families have come into our workplaces. As someone said, I'm not sure if do I work at home or do I live at work? So this is another challenge that a lot of us have had to deal with. We've obviously, from a company perspective, it's interesting to say that our employees have disappeared. And by that, I mean, we no longer see them face to face. So we miss all the cues that are typically used for assessing how they're doing. So all your body language cues of someone who's under stress, have suddenly vanished. And that points to some of the things that Nuala and Deepak both mentioned in terms of how do we deal with employees that we don't see and can't see anymore, or see in a very tiny window, which can mask a lot of challenges. And that means that we are seeing these kind of proliferation of challenges that we didn't have to deal with before, which I think we have a pastoral duty to now do, look after things like loneliness for people who live alone, a lot of mental health issues which have come to the forefront, families with young children who are struggling to kind of balance work and play, and unfortunately even things like a spike in domestic violence. All of these are now things, our colleagues, our employees, some of us are exposed to, and that's quite challenging. And the question is, how much of that do you want to expose to your company? And a very interesting question for organizations is, to what extent do we want to step into the lives of our employees? And I don't think there are very clear answers here, but obviously at a point where it starts impacting wellness, well-being, or productivity is clearly, for a lot of organizations, the point where they do want to do something. And of course, there's this other challenge of, not all our homes are set up for work. Sometimes, we're in each other's spaces. I know lots of examples of where husband and wife work for competing organizations. In our case, my wife works for a large retailer who happened to be a client of TCS. And it's always a tricky scenario whether I should be, sometimes I overhear conversations that I really shouldn't be a part of. It's not easy. And we're all learning to make sense of all of this. And in all of that, there is this concept which I call the radio effect, which is, when you went from radio to television, a lot of sports commentators especially started behaving initially as though they were still on radio. So they described everything in great detail. And it took a while for us to understand that actually television commentary is a bit different. We all have the habit of behaving in old ways under, when new technologies are available. And so it's taken us a while to adjust to the new ways of being. And when we go back and we find a new blended mean, that will happen again. And we have to be conscious of that. Let's not carry our old behaviors and just transpose them in a kind of lift and shift manner. I think that one of the things that I will call out that I think is really important here is this idea of wellness. And Deepak mentioned our work on, we have 450,000 employees that we've, taken remote. But we've also started looking at this kind of pyramid. At the base of it is connectivity. If you're not connected and secure, you can't work. So we've got something called secure borderless workforce that does that. Then we said, okay, what about productivity? So we fixed that problem, and we've got Zoom and Teams and everything. Then you've got, this right on top of that pyramid, you've got things like wellness, and which is where, to the point Nuala was just making, the legal framework and the regulatory framework allows us to understand what's right and wrong, and perhaps even some level of policing. But what we can do with tech also is provide a huge number of supports to employees and teams to make that work. So our wellness team has come up with a bunch of really interesting ideas around things like nudge, because at the end of it, what is interesting is all our work in remote working is happening on digital platforms. So the platform always knows when you're working, when you're not working, or when you're working on weekends, or when you've been up for half the night sending emails. So it is possible to, first of all, in a direct person-to-person, individualized way, as Nuala was mentioning, to actually send a nudge to an employee saying, take a break, go for a walk. You've done 4 hours of meetings consecutively. Do some exercise, whatever it is. But also, it's possible in an anonymized way to get that data and share that with team leaders to say your team is likely to be under stress because they're overworking or they're spending too many weekends at work. All of that's visible to us now. And I think with the right use of that data in an, as I said, anonymized manner, we can do a lot with it. But equally, when we go back to work, we will have to rethink those physical spaces, because I'm sure we won't go back to sitting at cubicles in the way we're used to. If there's a blended working model, and if you're all going back in a way that is basically to meet people at work and then come back and do the work at home, why would we design the office the same way? And consequently, how should we redesign our homes for the kind of things we talked about earlier? Which kind of leads to the point that we're no longer talking about workplaces, but workspaces. And work can happen anywhere, especially in the digital world. So designing workspaces and thinking of workspaces is really, really important for us. There are still unanswered questions. I talked about the whole point of serendipity. We haven't quite solved that in the digital world. Nuala covered a lot of really interesting areas, but even workplace insurance is an interesting topic. If you have an accident, if you fall down at your desk in your home while working for your organization, is that covered by workplace insurance? I know, I've had a chat with our HR organization and they say it is, but I don't think all the use cases are covered there. What about jobs that can't happen remotely? Are we unconsciously discriminating against people who can't work remotely? And what is the premium on that? And what about the social impact of all of this, of the loneliness, of the separation? How will we fix all of that? So there's a lot that we have to take on board. And I think digital solutions will continuously evolve. We'll get newer and newer interesting things to deal with the problems. But they say progress is always having better problems to solve. So in that sense, I'm really optimistic that we will actually get to a much better place. But it's worth remembering that every day there are some fascinating new things I come across. Excuse me. I think that there is one of the interesting things is, I talked about things like domestic violence. We do have the means, technologically, we have the means to today do things like even analyze video to see signs of stress. So someone could take this video stream and look at me speaking on this video, and using machine learning could conclude that I'm either less healthy than I should be, or I'm more stressed than I should be, or maybe I'm in some way suffering, I'm a victim of violence or abuse. So all of that is possible now. And I think we are always in this new technology and digital world, we are always in the realm of not just can we do it, but should we do it? And so we're seeing the re-entry of philosophy and ethics into technology, which is it's a really interesting area to think about. So some of us are, I've spent a lot of time in startups. I still work in a kind of startup mentality. So I have to be an optimist. So I really think that change is good. I think that all of this is going to take us forward, and we'll find a new normal, a new beginning. TCS, as Deepak said, has committed ourselves to saying this is actually a trigger for us to move to a new operating model. And I just want to end with one thought, that all evolution takes place against a backdrop of errors in gene replication, right? Our genetic mutation is going on, every instant, and right from the start of time, or the start of life, shall I say, genes are replicating and continuously making small errors, and each of those errors are magnifying, and some of them are being supported by the environment, and that's what creates evolution. In much the same way, the changing environment we find ourselves in, and all the mistakes that we are bungling our way through, will actually lead to really interesting solutions. We'll find better ways of working. We'll find amazingly new good ideas. Work will thrive. We'll find really interesting new ways of making remote working work. I'm absolutely sure about that. We don't always see it. As someone said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So I will hand over to David now, but I do want to say that I think we should all be really excited about finding even better ways of working, be it remote or in person or a blend of the two. Over to you, David.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Ved. Some really fascinating ideas there. That's a tough act for me to follow, particularly with data privacy and cybersecurity. But I suppose I want to just start off by saying that this topic, which is kind of one of the key legal dimensions, alongside the employment and health and safety dimension that Nuala talked about earlier, that we're seeing come out of the remote working arrangements in the pandemic scenario. It's sometimes seen as quite dry and quite compliancy. And I think at this stage we have, we've all done our GDPR training, at least I hope we have. And policies are rolled out in many organizations and so on. But I guess this is a topic that has a very practical dimension that the pandemic is very much bringing to the fore. So I think it's important to understand how it actually applies in practice in the situation we find ourselves in. And also it can't be said enough that although it is quite a sort of compliancy topic in some respects, the risks of getting it wrong are quite severe. So we're seeing real raises in, or real growth, should I say, in regulatory fines, in litigation from data subjects, including employees, around abuse of their data protection rights. And I think most importantly, in some cases, we're seeing serious reputational damage for organizations that get this wrong. I think people are increasingly aware of their data protection rights and place tangible value on their personal data. So I think they're increasingly reticent to deal with organizations that get these things wrong. So it's a very important and quite practical topic. In terms of the high level of what we're seeing, I think generally speaking, lots of organizations are getting it right and have pivoted very, very well to this completely different world that we're sort of seeing ourselves in terms of remote working. But there are organizations, particularly sort of smaller and medium-sized organizations, and that doesn't mean that they're not processing a lot of personal data, because often they are, that get this wrong, and that have resulted in issues coming across our desk. So I just wanted to expand today on some of those issues that we're seeing, and hopefully that will be helpful for some of you guys to perhaps avoid falling into some of the same traps. So firstly, I'm going to speak around cybersecurity. So there's lots of new ways of working, obviously, that have emerged from the pandemic. So the key changes, obviously, are employees having access to huge amounts of personal data in their homes, which previously would not have been the case with a lot of people working in an office-based environment. And then secondly, organizations becoming increasingly reliant on digital technology. So digital methods of communication, video conferencing, sharing files digitally, and so on, perhaps more than they were previously. And this means that there's a significantly increased vulnerability to cyber threats. And I suppose the categories of cyber threat that we're seeing, I think they sit in sort of three quite nice categories. So the first one is the physical security risks, I suppose. So this is kind of, to some extent, the practical stuff we think about with data security. So people have taken their laptops, they've taken their USBs with them home. So there's a risk of loss there, there's a risk of burglary, and so on. Even really practical sort of hard copy stuff under the kind of information security banner. So for example, using personal bins to dispose of work papers in a non-secure way. But there are some concerns, as well as those very practical ones that we were all kind of expecting, that hadn't been expected to quite the same extent. So as Ved mentioned, I think it's kind of coming to light how many people who work in the same sector live together, whether that's in a sort of marital scenario or a house share or whatever. We've had a couple of clients actually who've been quite surprised that quite a few of their junior employees, just with the nature of sharing flats in Dublin and so on, live with people who work for competitors. And in some cases, they're both working on opposite ends of the kitchen table. That's a huge data security risk that just wasn't something that we really contemplated a year ago. At the other end of the scale, let's say that was quite junior in that case. At the other end of the scale, we had a relatively senior person in an organization who, during the beautiful weather we had last year, took his conference calls from his back garden and was getting overheard. So these kind of very practical risks, I suppose, are the first category, physical security risks. Then you've got the more technical stuff, so vulnerability of systems. So the pandemic's seen an explosion in use of personal devices, by which I mean mobile phones, communication via methods we perhaps wouldn't have done previously, WhatsApp and so on, USBs to move files around and so on. And these devices, firstly, they've always been vulnerable, but now they're being used so much more. And also they're being used for things that they weren't used for previously to the same extent. So for example, we can now use there's now widespread use of mobile phones as authentication devices to log on to VPNs. That's a use that existed certainly before, but wasn't quite so widespread as it is now, and that's creating vulnerability. And also because we're at home, sometimes we're using home networks, sometimes we're saving documents outside of our VPNs on our desktops, sometimes we're sending documents to our home printers to print. Our home Wi-Fi networks aren't as secured as an office network would often be, and is open to hacking. And that could just be as simple as using the default password set by Virgin Media or our provider. Another aspect that we're seeing under this kind of vulnerability of systems banner, I guess, is sharing of information through unauthorized means. And I kind of mentioned it there with the use of WhatsApp in the work context, and saving documents locally on systems and what have you. That creates vulnerability to hackers. Those systems generally aren't as secure as office systems, but they also create broader sort of legal data protection risks. For example, key intellectual property of the organization isn't captured if it's saved locally on someone's desk. If you ever need to respond to a DSAR, a data subject access request from a data subject, then you need to make sure you're capturing the relevant personal data, and you're not if it's in someone's personal WhatsApp account. So that's a risk that we're seeing as well. And then finally, risks that result from changes in our communication channels is the third category that we're seeing. So the working from home environment, and so every feature of this pandemic that we're finding ourselves in, it really increases vulnerability to phishing schemes and also just human error. So employees are having to adapt very quickly to new ways of working and new processes. And sometimes things like training and policies that would have been in place previously haven't caught up. So for example, lots of organizations that previously would have had a two-step verification or hard copy method for authorizing financial transactions, payments, and so on, perhaps aren't doing that anymore. And you can see how this creates a real vulnerability to phishing, whether it's a call from someone impersonating the boss looking for a payment or something along those lines that perhaps would get through now that wouldn't have done previously. Also, I think it can't be overlooked that a lot of us are quite fatigued and quite stressed by this whole situation, particularly now as we reach sort of lockdown number 3 stage. And that makes employees particularly vulnerable to phishing scams and just simple human error, whether that's someone working on quite a small laptop screen that may find themselves much more likely to just accidentally CC the wrong contact in an email that perhaps wouldn't have happened in the office. So that's also a key risk as well. So say risks that result from changes in our communication channel. And I think what's important to remember with phishing in this context is that old kind of comic book trope that they only need to win once, whereas you need to win every single time. And it's possible for a very broad net phishing scheme to target an organization. And if you're not prepared and you don't have that training and organizational measures in place, that can be a real vulnerability and something that we've seen supercharged in the context of the pandemic. So as you can see, it's a very broad range of issues that we're seeing under that cybersecurity, information security banner. I think what's important to remember is that it will often be quite clear where a very large incident occurs. So whether that's a ransomware attack that targets an entire server, for example. But it could be an information security, cybersecurity issue could be as simple, as I've just mentioned, as someone being CC'd on an email that they shouldn't be. And I think it's really important to remember that there are, as well as the kind of broad compliance issues that we see on the data protection side, under that data protection banner, there are lots of sometimes quite small, very practical things that we also need to think about and be concerned about. And we need to make sure fundamentally that employees are aware of these issues so that if they do happen, well, hopefully they can be avoided, first off. And secondly, if they do unfortunately happen, they can be properly captured, reported, recorded, and potentially addressed if they need to be, because they've resulted in a data protection issue. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm not going to come on to my second topic that I wanted to discuss, which is the adoption of new technology and data protection issues. But if there are any sort of topical questions on that, I'd be very happy to answer them. So I'll hand back to you, Liam, to handle the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. And thank you to all our presenters this morning. That was a fascinating tour de force through an incredibly wide area. I could just, everyone, and Ved, if you could put your screen and mic back on as well, just invite all of our presenters back on screen. It'd be great, thank you. I suppose, and the problem after all of that has been so wide-ranging that where do you start with the questions that are coming in? But in trying to summarize them, I think, and let's just start with Deepak, and maybe the rest can comment on that, because I'm getting the impression coming through this that from a managerial perspective and potentially from a technological perspective, remote working can be made to work, can be very, very beneficial, but that there is, I suppose, the challenges are as much legal and cultural as much as anything else. And maybe if I get some, do you want to comment on that, Deepak? Is that the case? Because it does feel that we're moving ahead, but that there's a lot of things that have to be done to facilitate that, and probably not least the psychological aspect to it as well.
No, definitely, Liam, and a lot of organizations are really trying out and struggling as well to a great extent to ensure that the culture is rightly managed. But there are a number of new solutions that we can see. Like for example, there have been a number of town halls which have been easily possible by different executives who are able to log in from different parts of the world and address to the entire team. This was never possible earlier. Now you are able to have a number of different workshops to be arranged in a very quick manner. You're able to also provide the required tools for people to contribute in a very efficient manner as well. And it's become so easy to communicate. It's no longer about trying to get some, meeting days in diaries, trying to schedule your flights, staying in hotels for, a couple of hours of workshops or meetings. So in a way, it's brought a number of people in the organizations together very close, and that's working to build a right kind of culture and promote the key aspects of the company culture across the organization. But I'll invite any other comments anyone may have on this panel as well. Thank you.
Maybe Ved, just carrying on from that, in that context, what does tomorrow look like from a technological perspective? What technology is available to do that? And if you're building and keeping that culture together, one of the struggles I've had is when on the rare occasions when I've been able to actually have meetings over the last year, physical meetings, and there have been people attending, let's say, for example, remotely at the same time, they've been a disaster, to be perfectly honest. And how do people communicate? How do you integrate from a technological perspective, or what are the ideas out there at the moment of integrating the two elements in tomorrow's world?
So thanks, Liam. I think the first, of course, I think we've all felt that, when you have that one laptop stuck at the corner of the desk and someone has dialed in on Zoom or whatever is not pleasant. I think what you will find, of course, is that right now it's been a great equalizer. Everyone's remote, so that problem has been better. But the moment we go back to work and we've still got the one person working remotely, is something we have to solve for. What we're seeing in that world, and I don't think we're there as yet, but certainly this year we'll have pushed that curve a lot more, is the improvement of things like augmented reality, virtual reality solutions. One of our teams has, we have a research lab that's been working on telepresence, which is really where you almost have, if you remember Second Life and applications like that, sort of where everyone can actually appear in a virtual reality environment, but not as clunky as we've known it. So that gets better and better and better. So perhaps there is a time in the not too distant future where we will have an ability to work in virtual environments where it's a combination of kind of being remote, but also having a sense of physical or physicality. But equally, I think what the other piece that will move us ahead a lot more is just our ability to get the data from these virtual environments and continuously improve. We'll know what's going wrong much more easily. We'll know how to fix more and more problems because the base data is getting richer and richer, and it's global. So for me, those are the two most important things: sort of improvement in the technologies that get us towards collaboration. And we've seen lots of really interesting tools. I don't know if you use whiteboarding tools like Miro. These have all come on in leaps and bounds this year, and I think that'll be a massive difference maker as well. But let me also say that for global corporations like us, I think what this has also done is allowed us to blend cultures. As you said, remote working is cultural, but now that you've got all cultures working together in a way that we never did before, you can't keep cultures apart anymore. And I think that's fascinating as well. We can all learn from each other.
Thanks, Ved. And maybe on that, and sorry, I'm a science fiction fan, so I love the idea of kind of sitting around. It's like Star Trek, and we all arrive at our conference table and sit down, and there's we just want to leave, so we just fizzle out. But presumably, Nuala, from a legal perspective, then you're looking at, well, that encroachment versus the, if you like, the central workspace versus the home workspace. And I always get the impression as well that some people have this idea that kind of there's a cost saving in not having the office there as well. But realistically, there's quite a cost then in enabling employees, and a legal challenge in enabling employees like that to work from home in that sort of environment.
Yeah, and I suppose, Liam, none of us are naive to the fact that we were told to go home practically overnight and we didn't really know what to expect. I mean, certainly when I look back at what I even brought home, difficult, lack of Post-its, different really random practical things that you need day to day. But it is hard to, be put into a scenario or thrust into a scenario where you're looking to your legal obligations, but there's obviously resourcing required to do that, and an expenditure. And I suppose for a lot of employers, it's not unheard of at all in terms of what I'm seeing, that maybe people haven't done all the things that they're supposed to have done. Shouldn't be doing that as a lawyer, but you know what I mean, until, early 2021, but that's the reality. So it's really meeting those challenges and finding out what works for you, because as Ved says, there are lots of different innovative ways to meet this, and maybe it's a better place to be in nearly a year on, when people have worked through it and you can look to peers and to comparators. So absolutely difficult for employers. I suppose the other thing I would say from an employment law perspective is that for a lot of individuals and their employers, and I've seen it in our own office, you need to work with those individuals in terms of their particular scenario. So, childcare has been a really key issue, for example, for a lot of people this year who are trying to do their Zooms, do their calls back to back, and balance that against their particular personal scenario. So what I'd often speak to is tolerance in terms of employers, and bearing in mind everyone's situation is different, and you're best placed to meet your obligations if you don't look at them as being the same for absolutely everyone. There's work involved in that, but that's really important, I think, that focus.
No, I certainly feel that as somebody who, in a very recent event with about 200 people on the call, my 6-year-old came in and launched something across the room in a tantrum. So that is certainly the case. But Nuala, just on that, and I just before I go to David, there's also kind of the split there in relation to kind of what are the employees' responsibilities, let's say, in relation to their own health and safety, because with flexibility comes a degree of empowerment, you could say it in one way, but also that leads to responsibility as well.
Sure, absolutely. And I suppose, again, maybe as I come at this from my angle, you're obviously more focused on the employer's obligations, and that's what employers look to. But bear in mind also that as an employee, I mentioned statutory obligations. There already is a statutory provision to deal with employees' obligations in relation to the workplace and their own health and safety and that of other people. That's not new. Again, it's nearly 20 years old. So it's really adapting that to look at it when the workplace becomes home. So if you're trying to assess those risks with employees, absolutely they're obliged to play ball with you, to get on a video call with your person who's going to assess their workstation from a health and safety perspective, to attend training that you might roll out, to dial into your team calls, to play a part, to participate, and to really engage as well. Things like performance. I've managed a few difficult scenarios in the last year where performance when someone is working from home is much harder to try and manage when you can't have a face-to-face meeting, but there are absolutely workarounds, and this is the reality. We have to find the best way to address all these things when we're not all sitting around a table together.
And then the question is, where is working from home, I suppose? And maybe David, I know you were talking earlier kind of about the issues of data and security and that, but I know for a fact that, if you're going to work from home and the technology is there, why wouldn't you work from somewhere nice? That especially if we're not allowed to go out in the evenings and there's no restaurants opening or anything like that. There's people in the west of Ireland, I know, working here. There might be people on sunny islands place. I know Greece have a remote working policy to encourage people there. But presumably from a data perspective, how does that work, and the transfer of data, and then security? What happens if something goes wrong when people are so far away?
Yeah, of course, it's a very live issue. And I'm not sure where you are, Liam, but Ireland currently is a sunny island, just where I am, at least at the moment.
Oh, it's lovely here in Ireland.
Lovely bit of sun at the moment. But yes, it's something that we're definitely seeing. We're seeing lots of queries on this, and it picks up on a point that Nuala made earlier. So if you're outside of the jurisdiction, i.e. not in the jurisdiction which you're employed, you've got a different employment law regime applicable to you. We haven't got any tax lawyers on the call, but there's also a different tax regime that applies to you. And data protection, as you say, is also an issue. So we've got free movement of data within the EEA, the EU plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, but and a sort of a bridging arrangement in place with the UK. But as soon as you get outside of Europe, then you are sort of a data exporter, and there are various protections in place to protect data subjects' rights where they do have their data exported out of the EEA. So, for example, if you are going further afield and you do find that you've got employees who are perhaps want to go home to India or to the US. Or wherever, just to sort of ride out the pandemic, which was a big sort of trend, particularly earlier on. You do really need to consider that from a data protection perspective and make sure that you've got those arrangements in place to allow that data export and ensure that the data is protected to an adequate degree. And the sad truth with that sometimes is that it is just sometimes not worth it for the benefit of one employee who wants to work in a particular jurisdiction outside the EEA. So we are seeing, I think, an increasing trend of some of those employees who were allowed to go off to wherever in the world they wanted to be to complete their work, because now they can, actually being asked, do you mind coming back to Ireland to complete your job for that reason? And then there was also actually just a separate point in what Nuala mentioned or in the discussion beforehand that I just wanted to pick up on. And I think it's this kind of comes from a data privacy perspective ultimately, but I think it's this balance between the discussion around employees having their own responsibilities to make sure that they are being productive and they are looking after their own health and safety and their own well-being and so on. There's a kind of a balancing act, I suppose, that we need to strike between being involved and looking after our employees and being intrusive. And as soon as we cross over into that line of being intrusive, then it creates a sort of employee relationship issue, but it also creates a potential legal data privacy issue where you find yourself monitoring your employees in a way that just isn't allowed under data protection law in many cases. So I think that's a really interesting theme and something that we've seen a lot of, and I think we'll see a lot of that going forward as we adapt to working from home on a long-term basis.
Thanks, Ved. And sorry, Ved.
I was going to add to that and also ask a question of my own, if I may. I think that this is a really interesting topic, and I touched upon it. How much should the employee know about, an employer, and vice versa, and to what extent do we want to be in the lives of our colleagues? But what we found, for example, is one of the really interesting things that works is to foster communities, right? It's not the company doing it; it's employees kind of fostering a support groups for each other, and we have innumerable support groups at play in TCS. I'm certainly a part of some of them, but I know there are many others. So you've got groups of single parents who are reading stories every evening to children, so that childcare can be shared. You've got mental health and diversity groups, and I think we are also seeing this emergence of a multi-tiered communication. Therefore, so for example, me in my team, I'm my usual ways, I don't like to get too involved at a personal level, just with what's going on with my colleagues. But I think under this environment, we've all had to do a little bit more, because if you've got colleagues who are living alone or have childcare issues or have whatever is their personal circumstance, we do have to be in each other's lives a little bit more. And we can do that by creating this dual layer. We have a WhatsApp group where we just share stuff that is non-work related. It's all fun stuff, but it's nice to be able to tell someone that you went for a walk on a Sunday morning because the weather was nice, because suddenly you have no one to share that with, and that's really important as well. So I think the data challenge can in part be offset, not solved, offset by kind of allowing and encouraging employees to kind of form communities and form support groups for each other. My question is a little bit different, if I may. I happen to have a small team which has multiple nationalities represented, and I suddenly had the Spanish person in my team saying, "Can I go back to Spain and work for a few weeks?" Or a French person saying, "Can I go back to Paris and work?" And I know that the legal framework often has to catch up with whatever circumstances, because obviously this is a legal challenge at some point. You have tax laws and things like that. But given that today in this world, we can actually hire talent from anywhere, you don't have to be, able to commute into work. Now, given those data migration laws that David just spoke about, do we see that changing? Could I hire someone, do you think, maybe in a year's time or a couple of years' time, whatever, from a different part of the world, have them work on my team, which is nominally in London, but not have to worry about the tax implications of that and the data implication? Do we see that world at all, or do we think that's a step too far?
It's a really interesting question. And I think there's a data protection element to it, but there's also, as we say, an employment and a tax element to it, and so on. I mean, I suppose I'm just conscious of the time, but I mean, offshoring is nothing new. I mean, that's been going on for a very long time, and provided you put the arrangements in place, there's generally a solution that will allow that. I guess the question is whether previously we would have had our employees and we would have had our offshore operations, and never the two shall meet. Whereas perhaps now what we're seeing is that merging a lot more, and that's a sort of a hybrid model. And as you say, the law will need to kind of catch up with that to some extent.
Yeah, and Nuala, do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, and I suppose, I agree with David in what he says, that this is not necessarily new, but it's something that probably will be looked at by employers, because we've seen how we can diversify and the different ways in which we can work. So I think, Ved, to speak to your question, I do see changes coming in that regard, but it requires a bit of work because, as you say, the law has to catch up. There are significant risks for employers in certain contexts involved because unwittingly you can create an establishment or a place of business in a jurisdiction in which you had no intention of ever having operations. So it's planning and it's looking at those things as challenges that we might want to overcome. There's a difference and a distinction between being employed in one jurisdiction with an Irish contract and going home to France and starting off in a different jurisdiction. So it's really just, seeking appropriate guidance to make sure you don't fall foul of something you didn't even expect. But I do see it being something that will happen more and more because of all the good things we've learned in the last 12 months.
I think we're slightly coming up to time here, but I just want to finish off. I just want to let Deepak in on that, because it strikes me as well that along with the legal side, there's maybe kind of the old paternalistic sort of relationship between employers and employees is increasingly becoming a thing of the past. Now, when you talked about an inflection point earlier, maybe that's one of the great things. This has been happening for decades, but maybe that is change in that relationship and the increase in trust between employers and employees is maybe one of the things that will come out of this from a managerial perspective, Deepak.
Absolutely, Liam. I can't agree with you more. I think there is a lot of emphasis on how people can build the trust in spite of the challenges that exist. And as Ved pointed out, technology is really helping many of these aspects to happen. There's also increased awareness amongst employers as well to ensure that there is a mental, support which is provided for people going through tough, challenging times associated. There are a number of employee assistance programs which have been initiated. HR has been playing a key role in terms of, not only as Ved was suggesting, one is work-related aspects, but how can you, we have seen the companies doing Zumba classes for not only the employees, but even the families for that matter. And how do you kind of keep the balance between what's required to be done remotely, as well as how they can ensure a full 360 participation from employee and their families as well. So a lot of interesting things happening in the space, and I'm sure things will mature off in the coming years. But on a conclusion note, I see it as a positive and a much more of growing aspects of the business in the coming months and years.
And then just to wrap the session up really quickly with a quick question, and it's come through in the Q&As as well, something I had as well, and it goes back to Ved's comment on culture and that. And I suppose we need to remember as well that we're a privileged class here, a privileged professional class operating culturally cross-border and whatever else. And it's not a new idea. It's quite an old idea that the real divisions are more social and economic across the world than actually national, country to country. And I suppose starting with that, Ved, are you seeing the same sort of things happening in India as that? And how do you see that sort of cultural sort of dynamic developing over the next couple of years?
This is a tough question when you've come to the end of the show, and this could be a debate by itself.
We'll try and keep this one short. I was hoping the time would.
I'll just take no more than 90 seconds. So first of all, I think it's worth calling out that if you look at TCS employees in India, I would argue that you're already talking about within that environment a privileged class. You have a job that is likely to be a long-term job. You've got, you're in a growth segment. You're kind of exposed to the world. But what we've seen is even there, obviously, everybody has a different home circumstance. In India, lots of people grow up in a town and then travel to a city for work. So you have a house, to David's point earlier, where 4 people share a house. They're like, they're flatmates, sharing rooms, spaces. And so this problem, and maybe they don't all work for the same company. So this is a significant problem. Not just the fact that bandwidth becomes a challenge. Bandwidth, network resiliency has not, historically been great, but it's really caught up. So I would say actually in India now, things like mobile and connectivity issues are kind of leaping ahead. So that's good. But I think the question that you're asking actually points to also the significant numbers of people in those parts of the world, including India, where remote working isn't a possibility. Where people have to travel to even get signals on their mobile devices. So I think there are oceans to cross in there. We should absolutely not trivialize the challenges that people will face. in kind of solving this, coupled with what is currently a very significant healthcare challenge, putting that, just for a second to one side. But I do think that it's the whole philosophy of saying, in tough times, you do get better ideas. So I think this will push us to working harder to solve those problems. And I'm hopeful that we'll look back on this phase and say, actually, that made us as a society stronger, fitter, and actually we move forward more in these 2 years than we probably did in the previous 5 or 10.
Thank you very much for that. And I think at that, given our time, I think we'll wrap up at that particular stage. I'd like to thank all of our presenters this morning, Deepak, Nuala, Ved, and David. It was absolutely fascinating. My apologies that we've gone just a tiny bit over, but I've noticed that we've kept the vast majority of our attendees through that, which meant that what was being said and what you were talking about was resonated very much with people. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time this morning. The next IIBA event that we'll be hosting will be in the latter part of March, when we're hoping to have both the Irish ambassador to India and the Indian ambassador to Ireland in for a discussion on the growing economic and business relationship between our two countries. So for this morning, I'd like to thank everybody very much. There's some great comments coming in on the Q&A. Some of them quite long, but we will capture those and we will put them out as well, so that we've captured all of the good comments and feedback and that's coming into us this morning. So thank you very much for your time this morning, and good day, and have a good day, and try and get some time out to enjoy the sunshine at some stage during the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.